Welcome to this edition of the 700 Club. It's finally happening. The president of Venezuela calling for a military uprising against the terrible abuses of the dictator, Nicolas Maduro. The question is, will the United States intervene? Will they call on us to help them? John Jessup has more.
That is right, Pat. Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido took to the streets with a political activist and a small group of heavily armed soldiers early today, calling for the military to rise up and overthrow socialist leader Nicolas Maduro. Guaido started the day's events when he appeared in an early morning video that showed him surrounded by heavily armed soldiers outside a Caracas airbase. He said the soldiers were protecting the country's constitution. Guaido went to the streets with activist Leopoldo Lopez, who said he'd been set free by members of the military in response to an order from Guaido. Lopez said, quote, "I want to tell the Venezuelan people this is the moment to take to the streets and accompany these patriotic soldiers." One of the soldiers said, "It's now or never." Guaido is the head of the National Assembly and is recognized by dozens of countries, including the United States, as Venezuela's president. Maduro's government said it's putting down a small coup attempt by military traitors working with right-wing opponents. The country's Supreme Court issued arrest warrants for Guaido, Lopez, and other opposition leaders. Florida Senator Marco Rubio encouraged Guaido supporters, tweeting, "Today there can be no bystanders in Venezuela. Military, police, judicial, and political leaders, you must either support restoring constitutional democracy or you are a supporter of Cuba's efforts to colonize Venezuela. The choice you make will define the rest of your life." Stay with CBNNews.com throughout the day for updates on this story. Meanwhile, Pat, back to you.
The question is, if Guaido calls for assistance, he can certainly ask the United States to intervene. And I think it would be legitimate to come to his aid. And I wonder if Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has gotten the option about doing that. But, you know, these drones we have are very effective, and the Hellfire missiles they can fire can take out a lot of people. And I think it's time that we offer to assist if Guaido asks for it. And that wouldn't be the Yankees intervening in a domestic dispute. It would be the president-elect of the country, the acknowledged legitimate leader, asking for assistance against a dictatorship. And the time has come now to get that man out of there. We've got to take action, and we can't allow this wonderful uprising to fail. And I appreciate Senator Marco Rubio saying the same thing. Now is the time to move. Once you start a movement of this nature, you cannot back up until there is victory. And I just think the time has come for that wonderful country to be freed from the terrible curse and the blight of socialism that's been laid upon it. John?
Pat, here at home, a 26-year-old U.S. Army veteran is in custody in California. Investigators say he was plotting terror attacks on several locations. Meanwhile, the FBI is releasing more information about that deadly synagogue attack. Mark Martin has more on both cases.
Investigators arrested Mark Steven Domingo, a military veteran who served in Afghanistan. They say he converted to Islam and wanted revenge for the New Zealand mosque attacks and discussed his deadly plans with undercover agents he met online.
The terror plot culminated with plans to bomb innocent people, causing dozens of deaths and serious injuries.
Domingo lives in Reseda, California. Federal authorities took him into custody a short time after he received what he believed were explosives from the undercover agents.
He allegedly purchased several hundred 3-inch long nails to be used in IEDs as shrapnel, specifically because the nails were long enough to penetrate the human body and puncture internal organs.
The FBI says Domingo talked about targeting Jews, churches, and police officers. And in addition to a Long Beach rally of white supremacists, he even talked about detonating a bomb at the Santa Monica Pier. Domingo's family released a statement saying they're surprised by his arrest. They also requested privacy. This as Southern California continues to deal with the deadly shooting at a synagogue in Poway over the weekend. Residents on Monday mourned the loss of 60-year-old Lori Gilbert Kay. Friends say she stepped in front of the rabbi to stop the accused gunman, 19-year-old John Earnest.
That we stand tall against the darkness of evil and anti-Semitism in the world.
Authorities say Earnest opened fire, taking the life of Kay and injuring 3 others. Earnest was a standout scholar, athlete, and nationally recognized pianist. The Associated Press reports his adherence to white supremacy and anti-Semitism shocked the people closest to him. His parents released a statement saying, "How our son was attracted to such darkness is a terrifying mystery to us." The FBI says it did receive a tip about a threatening social media post about 5 minutes before the synagogue attack, but it did not say who was the author of the post or the location of the threat.
The FBI says it tried to identify the writer immediately, but the shooting took place before the suspect could be fully identified. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Thanks, Mark. President Trump is ordering an overhaul of the asylum process, releasing a memo calling for new regulations within 90 days. It includes charging a fee for asylum requests and requiring most asylum applications be legally resolved within 180 days. It also calls for forbidding work permits to anyone who enters the country illegally. Border Patrol encountered more than 100,000 migrants entering the U.S. illegally last month, many of them seeking asylum. A new poll shows more than a third of Americans now see the situation as a crisis. That's up 11 points since January. The number of Democrats who see it as a crisis has jumped 17 points. Well, President Trump is suing 2 banks to prevent them from turning over records to congressional committees investigating his finances. His children, Don Jr., Eric, and Ivanka, are also part of the suit. The House Intelligence Committee and the Financial Services Committee issued subpoenas to Deutsche Bank and Capital One. The Trump's suit claims those subpoenas aren't valid because they violate privacy laws and aren't for the purpose of creating legislation. Well, swarms of government officials are in charge of America. Unelected bureaucrats are writing regulations that carry the force of law. Now, one senator is reminding us that's not how America is meant to be. Take a look. A rapidly expanding federal government is stripping power from the states and the people, creating a massive regulatory state that's saddling citizens with piles of red tape and enforcing political agendas that no one voted for. That's not the way America is meant to be. The Declaration of Independence says that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Today, though, many Americans don't seem to understand or appreciate the Declaration's gravity. As a result, it seems we've lost touch with much of what makes our country so special, the distinctly American belief in the dignity of every human soul. In his new book, Our Lost Declaration, Senator Mike Lee shares new insights into the events that shape the ideas in the Declaration of Independence and makes clear how what he describes as the many abuses of federal power we see today are happening because we've forgotten our leaders in Washington, D.C. serve us, the American people, not the other way around.
Senator Mike Lee joins us now from our Washington studio. And Senator, it's such a pleasure to have you back with us. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you, Pat.
Could I ask you what, the Declaration was written against the abuses of King George. What were some of the things that the Crown was doing to the colonists that the Declaration addressed?
As I explained in my book, Our Lost Declaration, King George III visited a number of privations of the dignity of the human soul on the American people, including, among other things, withholding his consent for the convening of legislatures, withholding his consent for legislation that would have allowed for the effective operation of the court system. I even refer to the fact that he played a significant role in the slave trade and in perpetuating that evil on this group of people. And I discuss in Our Lost Declaration the fact that Thomas Jefferson called the king out for all these infractions, including the latter one, including slavery itself. That language, unfortunately, was eliminated from the final draft. But language acknowledging that all men are created equal survived, and that, in turn, helped us ultimately get to the point where we could eliminate the abominable scourge of slavery.
You know, we did a series on a nation of criminals, and I've had our staff researching how many federal bureaus have put criminal sanctions on some of their regulations, And as I recall, there were something like 300,000 crimes that they have. Could you tell us a little bit about your feeling about that?
Yes, you correctly describe a problem that we've got in this country. We've got hundreds of thousands of pages of federal regulations on the books. Regulations put in place not by Congress, but by government bureaucrats acting pursuant to delegated authority by Congress. Whenever they decide to make a particular course of conduct criminal, that can become criminal. We asked a few years ago if we could find out the total number of federal criminal offenses that could be committed, including those so-called regulatory offenses. We were told that the total number was unknown and unknowable, but that there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000, probably more. This is insane. This is absolutely absurd, and this is exactly the kind of multiplicity and unnecessary complexity within the law that our founding fathers rebelled against and decided was too much.
Does the president have the power to nullify those things, just to say they weren't put in by Congress and therefore these federal regulatory agencies are not authorized to put these crimes on the books?
The president is subject to a series of laws that created each of these departments, agencies, and bureaus. And he's got some authority with regard to stopping the promulgation of new regulations. It's one of the reasons I'm pleased that President Trump's administration has made sure that for every new regulation it issues, it gets rid of at least two. They've taken a really strong, mature approach to this problem, which I would like to encourage and commend them on. With regard to those regulations that have already been put in place, there are ways of changing regulations. There are ways of getting rid of them. It is more time-consuming, more cumbersome. It is difficult. But fortunately, we do have a president who's committed to that. In the long term, what we really need, as I explained in our Lost Declaration, is for Congress to pass a series of reforms requiring that all new regulations should have to be approved by Congress before they take effect. This would put your elected lawmakers on record before they put something into law.
Do they not want to go on record? Is that the problem?
That is the problem. And one of the things I describe in our Lost Declaration is this phenomenon that you have today a group of federal lawmakers, most federal lawmakers, who perhaps see achieving perpetual smooth sailing re-election as of paramount importance, to the point that they're not even jealously guarding and defending that one prerogative that Congress and Congress alone has in our federal system, which is to make federal law.
Well, what does the Declaration have to say about the dangers of big government? In your book, The Lost Declaration,
first and foremost, it acknowledges that human beings have infinite worth. They themselves are valuable and equal in the eyes of God. And that as a result of that, we have to understand that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that whenever government becomes abusive of those ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish that form of government that's harming them. So in other words, the message of the Declaration of Independence and the message of my book, Our Lost Declaration, is that when government serves the people, great. When it doesn't, it is up to the people to fix it, to turn it around. Most importantly, that government is there to serve people, not the other way around.
You know, we have been dealing with the ACLU and the abuses that have taken place by the federal court system, and the Supreme Court has been the ultimate arbiter of our social norms in this country for some time, and a few unelected judges, I mean, it just takes a small number, have changed the way Americans deal with all kinds of things. What can be done to rein in the courts?
The best thing that can be done to rein in the courts, to make sure that we have better judges, is to elect a president who says that he will appoint judges who will read the law and interpret the law based on what the law says, rather than on the basis of one particular social policy or ideology. It's one of the things I'd like to commend President Trump for. During his time in office thus far, he's put people on the U.S. Supreme Court, on the appellate courts, and on the federal trial courts who have done precisely that. That is the biggest, strongest defense that we have against encroachment by the judicial branch on the other branches, particularly the Congress.
One last question. You've been considered as a possible candidate for the Supreme Court. Is that something you'd like to do, or is that in the cards for you at all?
Well, at the moment, Pat, I'm busy representing the people from the great state of Utah in the United States Senate. If at some point a vacancy came along and the President of the United States asked me to be considered for such a role, I would not say no.
Thank you, Mike Lee. God bless you. Hey, the book is called Our Lost Declaration, something you need to read and understand because we need to fight against tyranny, and the deep state in our nation has taken away the power that you have as citizens. Isn't that great?
So interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Mike Lee's a good guy.
Are you
huh?
done with the book? Can I have it now?
Yeah, you got it right now. All right.
All right.
All right. Well, did you know that snow melt can cause earthquakes? I've been talking about the tremendous snow melt in the Sierras. We're talking about many, many feet of snow. Let's go back to John for that story.
Well, Pat, before we get to that, a quick update on Venezuela. At the top of the show, you mentioned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's possible response to the uprising in Venezuela. Here's what he tweeted shortly after 9 this morning. Today, interim President Juan Guaido announced the start of Operation Libertad. The U.S. government fully supports the Venezuelan people in their quest for freedom and democracy cannot be defeated. The U.S. stands with Venezuela. Well, as you had just mentioned, Pat, new research shows heavy snow melt may have contributed to a series of earthquakes in California. In 2017, about 100 minor daily earthquakes shook an area near the Mammoth Mountain area over a period of a few weeks. Scientists now believe runoff flowing from the snow melt may have caused the seismic movement. High levels of flooding were recorded, Pat, during that seismic activity.
Well, we're also going to have a story about the flooding and some of the danger to the dams in California. It's much more serious than you could imagine, and we'll be talking about it on subsequent programs. But the fact that the melting of that enormous amount of snow is actually causing seismic tremors, that is a story.